Cuba's Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez delivered today the country's annual report on the blockade imposed by the U.S. over 50 years ago. He also announced that President Raul Castro will attend the UN debate about the blockade on September 26th in New York. Here now we have Jorge Gestoso, who is now on the phone for us. Jorge, are you there?
Yes, Regan, I am.
It's always great touching base with you. Now, the lifting of the blockade has been one of the main issues on the table after the re-establishment of diplomatic ties between Cuba and the U.S. Is there any progress in relation to this at all?
Well, today they are starting 3 days of action to end the U.S. blockade precisely here in Washington. We're talking members of about 60 organizations are coming from Canada, the U.S., and Puerto Rico, and they're planning to they have already set up 44 appointments within the Congress in order to meet with members of the Congress. They're going to meet with 37 members of congressmen and 7 senators. There are also this type of day of, if you want, activities, action to stop or to end the blockade is taking place, is having also a repercussion in other parts of the world. We're talking here, we're saying Brazil, Belgium, Canada, Russia, Switzerland, Sweden. So they are trying to create a very clear message that the blockade or the embargo, that's as they call it here in the US, has to stop. And also they're going to be asking for the US to withdraw from the Guantanamo base in Cuba and also to lift the limitations of traveling between the two countries, Regan.
Now, this blockade has obviously affected the government's ability to govern and to help its people, but it mostly affects the Cuban people, the blockade, the 50-year-old blockade. It's caused a lot of damage in the country, worth some $800 billion, according to today's report. How can the U.S. government justify this, Jorge?
Well, if the Congress, because it's the Congress, the member of the government that has the authority to lift the embargo or the blockade, if they will do their homework, wouldn't be that easy. What I'm trying to talk is out of the polls, 2 out of 3 Americans are in favor of the lifting of the embargo, and 2 out of 3 Americans are in favor of the normalization of the relations with Cuba. The fact is, the threat, the hurdle, is that there are many, many observers and experts that they identify that most of the congressmen are not necessarily at the service of the people of the U.S., meaning those 2 out of 3 that they want, if not of the large corporations or the lobbyists. So therefore, the big question mark is until which point or until when they are not going to hear the claim of the majority of the population and therefore keep the status quo, or until which point basically it's going to be so strong that message of the majority of the Americans that the page of the Cold War that was including precisely the blockade to Cuba is finished, and they have to turn the page. They have to follow what the American people say, and they have to establish commercial relations with Cuba, normalization of relations, normalization of the traveling, and therefore reestablish the relations that they should have had.
I agree with you there. We have to listen to the Cuban people. Now, there's a third side to this, Jorge. There are companies that have been affected as well, third parties, so to speak, in other countries. Have they at all tried to put any pressure at all on the U.S. government to lift the blockade?
Well, they see, if we're talking about business now, they see, forget about the political aspect. Those companies, those countries, those corporations, they see the potential of 11 million Cubans, 11 million new customers, people who could be able to buy. So they most definitely are very much interested to establish commercial relations, trade relations, and to be the first to land in Cuba in order to benefit from that opportunity. So therefore, even some of the members of the Congress that are really very much, if you want, sponsored by large corporations, are pushing, in that sense, to reestablish the relations with Cuba, the trade with Cuba, so lift the blockade in order to, quote unquote, make money with the new 11 million consumers or customers that could represent the Cubans.
Now, Jorge, a lot of intellectuals and authors around the world have criticized and written about the US's stance towards Cuba, its crippling effects on Cuba, and like people like Noam Chomsky, who's called the US a rogue state, a failed state, in their obsession with Cuba, hoping to cripple it, because the perspective is that a government such as Cuba, which is not looking to the US for any sort of assistance whatsoever, and is not under the control of the US, is posing some sort of a threat in the region and may serve as an example for other countries around the world to follow suit. Now, the Cuban foreign minister has submitted a report to the international community, to the UN rather, where he's going to address the lifting of the blockade. Do you really think that this is going to change things?
Well, I love some of the words of Noam Chomsky when they say, for example, making the diagnostic of the quote unquote the U.S. democracy, saying in the U.S. there are not two political parties like Republicans, Democrats. It's only one political party, the business party, and
yes.
Therefore the thing is, every country of the world that they challenge because they want to push and strengthen their sovereignty, like in the case of Cuba, and they challenge the U.S. because they stop to be a market for them. Basically, that's what the U.S. is trying to get all over the world, markets. If someone, in order to defend their interests and defend their sovereignty, become an hurdle, immediately becomes in the blacklist, in the list that, for example, include measures like the blockade, and therefore the uphill battle that Cuba and any country of the world that could dare to impose their sovereignty against the U.S., they have to face that sort of sanctions and also the media bashing, that because the mass media in the U.S. is, according to many observers, at the service, is a branch, is an arm of big corporations. Remember that 90% of the mass media in the U.S. is in the hands of 6 corporations. Their information reaches about 300 million Americans every night. So whatever they decide for the people of the U.S. to think or to hear, it's going to include the bashing of countries like Cuba, who decided to strengthen and reinforce their sovereignty and stand against that countries like they perceive that the U.S. That is not respecting their interests, and they want to impose the terms of ruling that relationship. So if you want, the foundations of this long conflict is big corporations trying to sell all over the world, and whatever countries they stop them to do so, they become the boogeyman.
Well, we certainly hope that these proposals by the Cuban foreign minister will make a dent and somehow represent the voices of the Cuban people as well as the international community who want the blockade lifted. Jorge, it's always great getting your perspective. And of course, we always appreciate your great reports. Hopefully we can touch base with you another time.